The Cabin of Sky Fly. Airlines Flight 476 shimmered with the restless energy of departure. Overhead bins clicked shut, seatbelts snapped into place, and the low murmur of conversation blended with the hum of the engines warming up. For most passengers, this was just another flight, a means to an end, a journey to somewhere else. But for the Dorsey family, it was a rare pause, a fleeting chance to reclaim a piece of normalcy in a life defined by duty and scrutiny. Jereal Dorsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, sat in the premium economy section, his broad frame filling the seat with a quiet authority that needed no uniform to convey. His glasses rested low on his nose as he scanned a book, though his mind was only half on the words. At 52, he had spent decades navigating the complexities of leadership, balancing the weight of national security with the personal sacrifices it demanded. Today, he wasn't a general or a strategist. He was a husband, a father, a man longing for a week of sunlit beaches and his children's laughter. Beside him, Camille Dorsey adjusted her daughter Amara's seatbelt, her movements gentle but precise, the hallmark of a pediatrician who had soothed countless children through fear and uncertainty. Her warm brown eyes carried a spark of anticipation, though it was tempered by the exhaustion of a life spent juggling her practice and her family's public-facing role. Across the aisle, their son Isaiah, 12 years old and wiry with curiosity, pressed his face to the window, watching the ground crew with the fascination of a boy who still found wonder in the world's mechanics. At 8, Amara was quieter, her small hands clutching a stuffed giraffe as she nestled against her mother, already dreaming of the vacation ahead. The Dorseys had booked these seats premium economy, a compromise born of a last-minute scheduling conflict that had left business class unavailable. Jereal had waved off the inconvenience with a chuckle, insisting that a few hours in a slightly less cushioned seat wouldn't dim their joy. They were together, and that was what mattered. The cabin felt like a cocoon, a space where they could be just a family, unburdened by the expectations that followed Jereal title. But cocoons are fragile, and this one was about to crack. A shadow loomed over their row, sharp and unyielding. Nancy Harper, a senior flight attendant with 20 years of experience, stood in the aisle, her Navy uniform pressed to perfection, her name tag gleaming under the cabin lights. Her face, however, told a different story, lips pursed, eyes narrowed, arms folded with a rigidity that suggested more than routine protocol. Behind her, another crew member, Karen Whitlock, lingered, her posture mirroring Nancy's, but with an edge of eagerness, as if she were waiting for a signal to pounce. "Tickets," Nancy said, her voice flat, cutting through the hum of the cabin like a blade. Camille looked up, startled. "I'm sorry?" "Your boarding passes," Nancy repeated, her tone sharper now, laced with an impatience that felt personal. "I need to see them." Jereal set his book down, his movements slow and deliberate. He had faced countless challenges, battlefield decisions, congressional hearings, moments where a single word could alter lives, but this was different. This was his family, his sanctuary, and the air was growing heavy with something he recognized too well, assumption dressed as authority. He reached into his jacket, retrieving the printed tickets they had already presented at the gate. "Here they are," he said, his voice calm but resonant, offering the documents with a nod. Nancy took the tickets, her fingers brushing the paper as if it might carry some hidden flaw. She studied them with an intensity that bordered on theatrical, her eyes flicking between the numbers and the family before her. Karen stepped closer, her crooked name tag catching the light as she peered over Nancy's shoulder. Her lips curled into a faint, knowing smile, one that made Camille's stomach twist with unease. "These seats are in premium economy," Nancy said, her voice carrying a note of accusation. She gestured to the row, her hands slicing through the air. "This section is for premium passengers." Jereal's brow furrowed, but his composure held firm. "Yes," he said, meeting her gaze. "We booked premium economy. Those are our assigned seats." Nancy's eyes narrowed further, and Karen's smile vanished, replaced by a hardness that matched her colleagues. "I'm going to need you to move to the back," Karen said, her words clipped and final. She thrust the tickets back toward Jereal, her fingers lingering as if daring him to argue. Isaiah turned from the window, his curiosity giving way to confusion. "Why do we have to move?" he asked, his voice small but clear, cutting through the tension like a bell. Camille placed a hand on his shoulder, her own confusion morphing into something sharper, something she had hoped her children would never have to feel. "Is there a problem with our reservation?" she asked, keeping her tone even, though her heart was beginning to race. Karen leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. I'm not sure how you got these seats, but this section is for premium customers. The word customers landed like a stone, heavy with implication. Jereal's jaw tightened, but he remained still, his years of discipline holding him steady. He had faced prejudice before subtle slights in boardrooms, overt hostility in his early career, but to see it directed at his family, in front of his children, was a wound of a different kind. We are premium customers, he said, his voice low and firm. We booked these seats weeks ago, and they were confirmed at the gate. Whispers stirred in the nearby rows, a soft rustle of curiosity and discomfort. Passengers glanced over, their eyes darting between the family and the two women in uniform. Some shifted uncomfortably, sensing the wrongness of the moment, but none spoke up. The cabin, once a place of shared anticipation, had become a stage, and the Dorseys were unwilling actors in a drama they hadn't chosen. Nancy's patience seemed to fray, her face hardening into a mask of authority. "Move!" she said, her voice rising, sharp enough to draw gasps from nearby seats, "or I'll call security." The word security was a spark in dry grass. Amara's eyes widened, her small body pressing closer to Camille's. Isaiah's hand tightened on his backpack, his confusion giving way to fear. Camille's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm, gathering their belongings with hands that trembled not from weakness, but from the effort to contain her fury. Jereal stood, his silence louder than any protest, his eyes locked on Nancy and Karen. He nodded once, a signal to his family to follow, and they began the long walk to the back of the plane. The aisle stretched endlessly before them, each step a reminder of the indignity they were being forced to endure. Passengers watched, some with pity, others with curiosity, but most with a silence that felt complicit. Isaiah clutched his backpack, his eyes darting between his parents and the women who had upended their peace. Amara held her giraffe tightly, her small frame dwarfed by the weight of the moment. Camille kept her head high, her hands steady on her daughter's back, but inside, she was raging not just at Nancy and Karen, but at a world that still made such moments possible. The seats at the back, near the restrooms, were cramped and worn, the air heavy with the faint scent of disinfectant. Camille settled Amara beside her, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure she believed. Jereal sat across from them, his hands clasped, his mind racing. This wasn't just about seats, it was about respect, about dignity, about the right to exist without being questioned or diminished. He thought of Isaiah and Amara, of the lessons they were learning in this moment, and his resolve hardened. This would not be their story's end. What they didn't know was that someone had been watching, someone whose presence would shift the course of this injustice. In the plush confines of first class, Marcus Langston set down his tablet and adjusted his cufflinks, his sharp eyes narrowing as he processed what he had just witnessed. A senior vice president at Skyfly Airlines, Marcus was on this flight to evaluate operations, traveling incognito to observe the crew without the filter of corporate deference. At 45, he had risen through the ranks by blending pragmatism with principle, a man who believed in systems but knew they could fail when human judgment faltered. The scene unfolding in premium economy wasn't just a mistake, it was a violation of everything Skyfly claimed to stand for. Marcus pressed a button on his phone, his voice low but commanding. "We have a situation on Flight 476. I need a full report on the Dorsey family's booking, and I need it now." His words carried the weight of someone who knew the cost of inaction. Marcus had grown up in a working-class neighborhood, the son of a teacher and a mechanic, and he had faced his own share of assumptions, store clerks trailing him, colleagues questioning his credentials. Those experiences had shaped him, not into bitterness, but into a quiet determination to hold power accountable, especially when it was wielded carelessly. Back in the main cabin, a younger flight attendant named Sarah Bennett watched from a distance, her heart sinking. At 23, she was new to the job, still learning the rhythms of the skies, and she hadn't yet adopted the hardened demeanor of her seniors. The Dorsey family had been polite, their tickets in order, their presence unremarkable, until Nancy and Karen had made it otherwise. Sarah's instincts told her something was wrong, but her inexperience held her back. She approached Karen cautiously, her voice tentative. "Do they have the wrong seats?" Karen didn't look up from her clipboard, her fingers tapping impatiently. "They didn't belong there," she said, her tone dismissive, as if the matter were already settled. Sarah frowned, her unease growing, but they didn't cause any trouble. The father was calm, the kids were quiet. Nancy, overhearing, shot Sarah a glance that could have frozen water, Mind your station, Sarah. This isn't your concern. But it was someone's concern. In first class, Marcus received a response to his inquiry. The Dorsey family's tickets were valid premium economy, booked and confirmed weeks in advance. A note in the system flagged Jereal Dorsey's name, not for scrutiny, but as a courtesy to ensure his privacy, given his high-profile role. Marcus's jaw clenched as he typed a new message. Handle this immediately. Expect a full update. Nancy and Karen, oblivious to the storm gathering, continued their duties with practiced efficiency. Nancy served coffee with a smile that never reached her eyes, while Karen checked the overhead bins, her movements brisk and self-assured. They believed they had acted decisively, protecting the order of the cabin, upholding some unspoken standard. But their certainty was a house of cards, and it was about to collapse. The cockpit phone buzzed, pulling Nancy away from her routine. She answered with her usual professionalism, her voice steady despite the unease creeping into her chest. "This is Harper." The voice on the other end was calm but unyielding, like the first rumble of thunder. "Ms. Harper, report to the cockpit immediately." Nancy's pulse quickened, but she smoothed her uniform and made her way forward, her steps measured. Karen followed, summoned by a separate call, her earlier confidence replaced by a flicker of doubt. Inside the cockpit, Captain Daniel Pierce and First Officer Aisha Khan sat with serious expressions, their usual camaraderie replaced by a gravity that set Nancy on edge. A small screen displayed a live video call, and on it was Elizabeth Monroe, Skyfly's Vice President of Operations, her face a study in controlled disapproval. "Ms. Harper, Ms. Whitlock," Elizabeth began, her voice steady but laced with steel. "We need to discuss what happened in your cabin." Nancy straightened, her years of experience anchoring her, though her confidence wavered. "Of course, there was a mistake with the seating." "Did you verify the seating before removing the passengers?" Elizabeth interrupted, her eyes piercing through the screen. Nancy hesitated, her mind racing for a defensible answer. "I reviewed the tickets," she said, her voice faltering. "They didn't look right." Karen nodded, eager to align herself with Nancy's narrative. "We thought there was an error. We were protecting the premium section." Captain Pierce leaned forward, his gruff voice cutting through their excuses. "I pulled up the manifest. The Dorsey family's tickets were valid. They had every right to those seats. The silence that followed was suffocating, a void where their justifications crumbled. Nancy's breath caught, her carefully constructed facade unraveling. Karen's face flushed, her hands twisting nervously. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed, her voice dropping to a tone that carried the weight of finality. "You humiliated a family in front of a full cabin without checking the facts. Do you have any idea who was sitting in those seats?" Nancy blinked, her confusion genuine. "No, Jereal Dorsey," Elizabeth said, her words sharp and deliberate. "Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a man who serves this country at the highest level, and you assumed he didn't belong." Nancy's face paled, her knees weakening as the magnitude of her error sank in. Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came, her earlier bravado reduced to ash. Elizabeth continued, relentless. "And that's not all. Marcus Langston, our senior VP, was in first class. He saw everything. Your actions have created a PR crisis mid-flight, and worse, you've betrayed the trust of every passenger on this plane." Nancy's voice trembled, a crack in her armor. "I didn't mean to." "Your intentions don't matter," Elizabeth said, her words a verdict. "Your actions do. Effective immediately, you and Ms. Whitlock are relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. You will remain seated until we land, and you will be escorted from the aircraft." Karen gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "But this is my career. This is not negotiable," Elizabeth said, her tone final. "You've made your choices. Now you'll face the consequences." Nancy's world collapsed in that moment. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, her ability to maintain order in the chaos of a crowded cabin. But now, faced with the wreckage of her assumptions, she saw herself as she truly was not a guardian of protocol, but a woman who had let prejudice guide her hand. Karen, younger and less seasoned, stood frozen, her dreams of a long career in aviation dissolving like mist. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted, a current of tension running beneath the surface. The other flight attendants avoided Nancy and Karen's gazes, their movements hurried and uncertain. Sarah Bennett, still troubled by what she had witnessed, found herself drawn to the Dorsey family. She approached them quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry," she said to Camille, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I should have said something. Camille offered a small, weary smile, her hand resting on Amara's head. It's okay, Sarah. You didn't do this, but thank you. Sarah hesitated, then added, They're reviewing everything. I think it's going to be okay. Camille nodded, but her heart was heavy. She looked at her children Isaiah, who was sketching in his notebook, his pencil moving furiously to distract himself, and Amara, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder, her giraffe tucked under her chin. Jereal sat silently, his hands clasped, his eyes distant. Camille knew he was processing not just the humiliation, but the broader implications for their family, for his role, for the world they were raising their children in. This wasn't just an incident. It was a wound, one that would leave scars. The plane continued its journey, the hum of the engines, a steady backdrop to the turmoil within. Passengers whispered among themselves, some pulling out phones to record or share the story online. A woman in row 14, a journalist named Lena Carter, had been watching closely, her fingers already typing a thread on social media. On Flight 476, a black family was forced to move from their rightful seats by flight attendants who didn't bother to check their tickets. This isn't just bad service, it's discrimination, and it's happening right now. Her posts were gaining traction, retweets piling up as the story spread beyond the confines of the cabin. In the hours that followed, the cabin became a microcosm of society itself, divided, conflicted, but not entirely silent. A passenger named Eduardo Rivera, a retired teacher sitting a few rows ahead of the Dorseys, had overheard the exchange and felt a pang of guilt for staying quiet. At 60, he had seen too many injustices to believe silence was neutral. He caught Sarah's eye as she passed, his voice low but firm. That family didn't deserve what happened. You're young, don't let this slide. Speak up next time. Sarah nodded, her cheeks flushing with shame and determination. Eduardo's words stayed with her, a reminder that courage wasn't just for the powerful, it was for anyone willing to act. She resolved to be better, to question rather than comply, even if it meant risking her job. Meanwhile, Marcus Langston remained in first class, his mind racing as he considered the broader implications of the incident. This wasn't just about one flight or one family, it was about a culture that allowed such moments to happen, a system that failed when human judgment faltered. He thought of his own daughter, a college freshman who had faced microaggressions at her predominantly white university, and his resolve deepened. This would not be swept under the rug. He sent another message to his team. Prepare a full review of our training protocols. We need to address implicit bias head-on. This stops now. When Nancy and Karen re-entered the main cabin, the air grew thick with anticipation. Passengers watched, their curiosity tinged with judgment. Nancy's shoulders were slumped, her earlier authority replaced by a hollow resignation. Karen's face was flushed, her eyes darting nervously, as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. But the moment that would define the flight came not from management, but from the family they had wronged. Jereal Dorsey stood, his presence commanding without effort, his voice calm but resonant, carrying the weight of a man who had spent his life fighting for what was right. That apology you're preparing, it should be to us, not just the passengers. Gasps rippled through the cabin, a collective intake of breath. Camille placed a hand on Jereal's arm, not to stop him, but to signal her unwavering support. She, too, felt the need for accountability, for a reckoning that went beyond corporate damage control. Isaiah watched his father, his young face a mix of pride and pain, while Amara stirred, blinking awake, her eyes fixed on her parents. Nancy froze, her face a mask of shame and defiance, torn between self-preservation and the truth pressing against her conscience. Karen looked away, unable to meet Jereal's gaze, her hands twisting nervously. I apologize for the inconvenience, Nancy stammered, her voice barely audible, clinging to the script she had been trained to follow. Jereal shook his head, his eyes unwavering, piercing through her hollow words. You didn't inconvenience us, he said, his voice steady but laced with controlled anger. You humiliated us. You assumed we didn't belong, in front of our children, in front of everyone here, and you did it without a shred of evidence. Camille stepped forward, her voice softer but no less powerful, carrying the weight of a mother protecting her family's dignity. You didn't just move us, she said, her eyes locking onto Nancy's. You made us feel like we were less than everyone else on this plane. You made my son question his place, my daughter fear her worth. And you didn't even pause to check if you were right. The cabin was silent, every passenger hanging on their words, the weight of the moment settling over them like a storm. Isaiah stood now, his small frame straight, his voice trembling but clear. "You didn't ask us anything," he said, his eyes fixed on Nancy. "You just decided." Amara clutched her giraffe, her voice a whisper but audible in the stillness. "I just wanted to sit with my family." The simplicity of her words cut deeper than any argument, a child's truth exposing the raw injustice of the moment. Passengers shifted, some wiping tears, others nodding in silent agreement. Lena Carter's phone was still recording, her live stream capturing every word, every glance, sending the Dorsey courage into the world. Nancy's shoulders sagged, her facade crumbling under the weight of their words. She tried again, her voice cracking, no longer scripted but raw. "I was wrong," she said, her eyes dropping to the floor. "I judged you without verifying. I humiliated your family, and I am truly sorry." Karen, prompted by a nudge from Sarah, stumbled through her own apology, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that." The apologies hung in the air, imperfect but real, a crack in the wall of prejudice that had brought them to this moment. Jereal nodded once, his expression unreadable, a man who had accepted apologies before, but knew they were only a beginning. Camille took a deep breath, her hand finding Isaiah's, her heart still heavy but lifted by the strength of her family's unity. As the plane descended, an announcement crackled through the speakers, Captain Pierce's voice steady but somber. "Ladies and gentlemen, we regret the incident that occurred earlier on this flight. Skyfly. Airlines does not tolerate discrimination of any kind. The employees involved, Ms. Harper and Ms. Whitlock, are no longer with our company. We are committed to making this right." Gasps echoed through the cabin, a ripple of shock and vindication. Phones lit up, capturing the moment as passengers shared the news in real time. Lena Carter's thread had gone viral, her words sparking outrage and calls for accountability across social media. "This is Jereal Dorsey's family," she wrote. "A man who serves our nation, treated like he didn't belong. This is why we fight." Nancy sat alone in a jump seat, her hands clasped tightly, her career unraveling before her eyes. She thought of her 20 years with Skyfly, the countless flights, the passengers she had served with pride. But now, faced with the truth of her actions, she saw herself through a new lens, not as a professional, but as a woman who had let assumption override reason, prejudice override fairness. Karen, seated nearby, stared blankly at the floor, her dreams of a future in aviation shattered by her own complicity. When the plane landed, the Dorsey family gathered their belongings with quiet dignity, their heads high despite the weight of the day. As they passed Nancy and Karen, who were being escorted off the aircraft, Isaiah paused. He looked at Nancy, not with anger, but with a disappointment that pierced her more deeply than any punishment. "You should have asked," he said simply, his voice carrying the wisdom of a child who had seen too much. Amara, holding her mother's hand, glanced at Karen, her small voice barely audible. "I hope you don't do that again." Their words lingered, a final judgment delivered not by authority, but by the family they had wronged. Outside the terminal, the fallout was immediate. News crews swarmed, tipped off by Lena's posts and passenger accounts. Headlines flashed across airport screens. Flight attendants fired mid-flight after forcing black family, including top military official, to move without cause. The story spread like wildfire, sparking debates about racism, privilege, and the power of public scrutiny to demand justice. In the weeks that followed, the ripples of Flight 476 reached far beyond the skies. Nancy Harper faced a reckoning of her own making. She applied to other airlines, but her name was tainted, her reputation a casualty of her choices. She spent evenings alone, replaying the moment she had chosen certainty over inquiry, assumption over empathy. She began to read books on bias, stories of those who had faced what she had inflicted, and slowly, painfully, she started to see the world through new eyes. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a beginning. Karen Whitlock, younger and less anchored, withdrew from the industry entirely, haunted by the realization that her silence had been as damaging as her actions. She returned to her hometown, taking a job at a local cafe, her dreams of soaring the skies replaced by a quieter life. But the memory of Amara's voice stayed with her, a reminder to question, to listen, to act with care. For the Dorsey family, the incident was a wound that would take time to heal. Jereal returned to his duties, his resolve strengthened by the need to model integrity for his children and his country. He spoke publicly about the incident, not to dwell on the pain, but to advocate for change, urging institutions to confront bias with courage and accountability. Camille threw herself into her work, finding solace in healing others, but she and Jereal carved out time to talk with Isaiah and Amara, ensuring they understood their worth despite the world's failures. Isaiah began writing, his sketches giving way to stories of justice and resilience, a way to process what he had seen. Amara, quieter but no less affected, started a scrapbook of their trip, pasting in photos and notes, a reminder that their joy could not be erased. Together, the Dorseys rebuilt, their love and unity a shield against the scars of that day. Skyfly. Airlines issued a formal apology, offering the Dorsey family compensation and launching a comprehensive review of its policies. Marcus Langston spearheaded the effort, implementing mandatory training on implicit bias and creating a task force to ensure accountability at every level. He thought of his daughter, of the Dorsey's children, and knew that change was not optional, it was essential. Lena Carter's reporting earned her a platform, her story amplifying voices that had too often been silenced. She met with the Dorseys weeks later, not as a journalist, but as a mother, thanking them for their courage. Eduardo Rivera wrote a letter to Skyfly, praising Sarah's small act of kindness and urging the airline to nurture employees who dared to question. Sarah, inspired by his words, enrolled in a leadership program determined to rise through the ranks and create a culture of empathy. The story of Flight 476 became a touchstone, a narrative woven into classrooms, boardrooms, and dinner table conversations. It was a reminder that prejudice, unchecked, could unravel lives in moments, but also that justice, though sometimes delayed, could prevail when courage and accountability aligned. It spoke to the power of dignity, the necessity of empathy, and the enduring truth that no one's worth should be assumed or diminished. For Jereal, Camille, Isaiah, and Amara, the journey continued not without pain, but with a renewed commitment to their values. They stood taller, not because they had won, but because they had endured, their love and resilience a beacon for a world still learning to see.